Let me tell you about the last haul I ever made. My name is Derek Winslow, 53 years old, and I've lived my whole life on Foggy Branch Road in Silver Ridge, Virginia, a town so small it doesn't show up on most maps, about 40 minutes outside of Roanoke, where the Blue Ridge Mountains start to get serious and the fog rolls down like a curtain most mornings. I've been driving a truck since I was 22. Got my CDL the summer after I graduated, and in the 31 years since then, I've logged more miles than most people drive in 3 lifetimes. Route 47 runs right through Silver Ridge, cutting through farmland and small nothing towns, continuing west into the backcountry, where the land flattens into wide open nothing that makes you feel small and alone. I've driven that stretch more times than I can count, know every curve and pothole like the back of my hand. My daddy drove this route before me, and his daddy drove it before him, and I remember sitting at his kitchen table when I was just a boy, listening to him tell stories about the things he'd seen out there, the strange lights and the cold spots and the feeling of being watched when nobody else was around. He told me once that the road has a memory of its own, that it remembers everyone who's ever driven on it, and that sometimes, when the conditions are just right, the road lets things through, things that don't belong here, things that have been waiting for you since before you were born. I laughed it off back then because I was young and didn't believe in ghosts or curses or any of that nonsense. But standing there in that parking lot weeks ago, I started to wonder if maybe my daddy had known something I didn't, had seen something that I was about to see for myself. That night the fog came in fast and thick, the kind of dense white wall that swallows everything and turns the world into a gray void, and my headlights barely cut through it, making things worse instead of better. I know how to handle fog, been driving through it my whole life, but this felt different, felt wrong, like something was pressing down on my cab, making it hard to breathe, and I remember thinking that if something was going to happen, it was going to happen tonight. That was when I saw the lights appearing out of the murk like a mirage, warm yellow glow growing brighter as I got closer. There was no way there should be lights out here, no way there should be a building in the middle of all this nothing. But as I got closer, I saw a sign above the entrance that read Earl's Place in chrome letters, with a smaller marquee beneath it that said Truckers Welcome, open all night in faded neon. The parking lot was full of trucks, dozens of them, more than I could count, and every single one had their engines off and their cabs dark, not a single light glowing from any window. I remember thinking how strange that was. How strange it was that none of these trucks seemed to have anyone inside them. But my body was giving out on me. 17 hours on the road will do that to a man. And I figured a bathroom break and maybe some food would help me finish this run and get home. I pulled in and parked my rig near the entrance. And as I stepped out of the cab, the cold hit me right away. A different kind of cold than what I was expecting. Cold that felt damp and thick and seemed to soak right through my skin and settle into my bones. The fog was everywhere, wrapping around me like a wet blanket, and I walked toward the entrance with my hand on the door handle, looking at the other trucks and wondering where all the drivers were, why every cab was dark and silent. Why none of these rigs had steam coming out of their exhausts, even though the night was cold enough to see your breath in the air. Something felt off about this place, something I couldn't put my finger on, but I was too tired and too desperate to stop, and I pushed open the door and walked inside. The moment I stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a wall, that particular kind of warmth that comes from too many bodies in too small a space, and I was immediately struck by how many people were sitting at the tables and booths. Truckers, at least 40 of them, maybe more, all wearing the same kind of flannel shirts and canvas jackets you see at every rest stop between here and the Canadian border. They were eating, or rather, they had food in front of them, plates of meatloaf and bowls of mashed potatoes and glasses of iced tea, sweating condensation onto the tables. But none of them were actually eating. I watched a man in a red cap lift a fork to his mouth, and then just hold it there, frozen, his jaw slightly open, his eyes fixed on the far wall with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The silence was the worst part, broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional clink of a plate being set down by a waitress who moved like she was underwater and never once looked up from her tray. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back tight and a face that had no expression whatsoever, the face of someone who had long ago stopped seeing the people she served as human beings. Every single trucker in the room was doing the same thing, sitting motionless with their forks suspended in midair, their eyes locked on that same spot on the far wall. And I felt a coldness spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I walked to a booth near the entrance because I wanted to be close to the door, a habit you develop when you spend decades on the road and learn that comfort can become a trap. The vinyl seats were cracked and worn, the kind of seats that have held thousands of tired drivers over the years, and I sat down and waited for someone to take my order. The waitress, with the tired eyes, appeared beside me with a laminated menu that was sticky with grease and asked me what I wanted, and I ordered a cup of coffee because that was all I could think of at the moment, my mind still trying to process what I was seeing. These frozen men, and that silent waitress, and the way the air in here felt thick and heavy. The coffee came in a chipped mug that said, "World's Best Dad," in faded letters, and it was the best coffee I had ever tasted. Rich and hot, and exactly what my exhausted body needed. But I could not stop looking at the other truckers, at the way they sat motionless with their forks frozen in place, at the way their eyes never blinked. I followed their gazes to the far wall where a large analog clock hung in a metal frame, and that was when I first noticed that both hands were frozen in place, the long hand pointing at 12 and the short hand pointing at 7. And even as I watched, neither moved, not even a tremor. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 7:04, and I looked back at the clock and saw that it still said 7 o'clock, and I remember thinking that someone probably just forgot to wind it. But something about the way the truckers were staring at it made me feel like it wasn't that simple, like there was a reason they were all looking at it, like something important was supposed to happen at 7 o'clock and never did. I set my mug down and walked past the rows of frozen men, feeling their attention on me even though none of them had turned their heads, feeling it like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. And I stopped at the hallway in the back where the walls were covered in old black and white photographs of truckers standing in front of their rigs, each one with a brass plaque beneath it bearing a name and a date. I ran my eyes along them, reading the names like I was reading a memorial. Names like Bobby Joe Simmons and Earl Washburn, drivers who had vanished on this stretch of Route 47 over the years. Drivers whose trucks were found abandoned on the side of the road with the engines still running and the doors hanging open like someone had stepped out for a moment and never came back. I kept walking along the wall, past the rows of men who never turned their heads to watch me pass, past the counter where the older waitress never stopped wiping the same spot on the dirty formica, and I kept looking at the photographs because something about them made me feel uncomfortable, made me feel like I was being watched from inside the frames. Each photograph had a small brass plaque beneath it with a name and a date. And I ran my eyes along them, reading the names like I was reading a memorial wall, and I recognized some of them because my daddy had told me stories about the men who had disappeared on this stretch of Route 47 during his own years as a driver. There was Bobby Joe Simmons, vanished in 1962 with his rig and a full load of peaches that were never recovered. There was Earl Washburn himself, the legendary driver who the truck stop was supposedly named after, disappeared in 1958 along with 3 other drivers who had been convoying together. There were more, dozens of them, and each face looked like they had been caught in a moment of happiness, unaware that they were posing for a photograph that would hang on a wall for the rest of time as a memorial to someone who would never come home. Some of the plaques had dates from the 1970s and 1980s, some as far back as the early 1950s, and I remember thinking that this place must have been around for a long time, must have been a popular stop for drivers who knew the route. But I also remember thinking how strange it was that I had never heard of it before, never seen it on any map or GPS or road sign, never seen it listed in any of the truck stop directories that drivers keep in their cabs for reference. I kept walking, kept reading, kept feeling that coldness grow inside my chest, and I reached the last frame on the right side of the wall. The frame that held a photograph of a man with broad shoulders and a strong jaw and dark hair combed back from a high forehead, and I stopped dead in my tracks because the face in that photograph was my face. Not my face as it looked now, aged and weathered by decades of sun and wind and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from a lifetime of driving, but my face as it had looked 30 years ago when I was young and strong and full of the kind of reckless confidence that kills people. The name on the plaque was Derek Winslow, and the date was October 14th, 1974. And I stood there staring at it while the sound of the diner seemed to fade away around me. The hum of the lights and the clink of plates and the soft breathing of the frozen truckers all getting quieter and quieter until the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I dropped my coffee mug and it shattered on the floor, pieces of ceramic scattering across the linoleum like broken teeth. And the sound was loud and sharp and should have drawn attention from every person in that building. But none of them moved. None of them looked. None of them acknowledged that anything had happened at all. The waitress with the dark hair appeared beside me with a mop and a dustpan, and she swept up the pieces without saying a word, without looking at me. And when she was done, she walked away and left me standing there with my heart pounding in my throat and my hands shaking at my sides. I reached out and touched the glass of the frame, and it was cold. So cold it burned my fingertips, and I could feel something pulsing behind the glass. Something that felt like a heartbeat, and I knew that this photograph was not just a picture of a man who looked like me. It was a picture of me. Me from a time I had never lived. Me from a year I was not even born yet. Something in my gut told me to leave. That familiar voice that has saved my life more times than I can count. The one that speaks in hunches and gut feelings and the kind of pure animal instinct that humans still carry from their days as prey animals hiding in the dark. I stepped back from the photograph and turned toward the door with my legs shaking beneath me and my mind screaming at me to run. But when I got to the entrance, I grabbed the handle and pulled, and nothing happened. The door was locked, and there was no sound of a lock clicking, no resistance, no struggle. It simply did not open, as if the handle was connected to nothing, as if the door was a painting of a door and not a real door at all, as if this entire building was a facade built to trap people like me. I pulled harder, threw my shoulder against it, beat my fists against the glass, and still nothing, and the people in the diner behind me had not moved, had not reacted, but I could feel their attention on me now, could feel it like a physical weight on my back, the weight of their collective stares pressing down on my spine until I could barely stand. I turned around and faced them, all 40 or 50 of them, still frozen, still staring at the wall, still holding their forks and spoons and cups in positions that seemed to defy the laws of physics. And I saw that some of them were smiling now, smiling without moving their faces, smiling with their eyes in a way that made my stomach clench and my vision blur. I forced myself to walk back to my table, to sit down, to think, because panic would not help me, had never helped anyone, and I needed to understand what was happening before I could figure out how to escape. I looked at the clock again, at the frozen hands, and I realized that the time was exactly 7 o'clock. Had been 7 o'clock when I walked in, and I looked at my watch and saw that it was now 7 o'clock. Had been 7 o'clock 5 minutes ago when I dropped my mug, and I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that my watch had stopped working at exactly 7 o'clock, that the battery had died at the precise moment I stepped into this place. And I wondered if that was a coincidence, or if something had drained the life out of it, the way something was draining the life out of me. I looked around the diner again, at the frozen men and the silent waitresses and the fog pressing against the windows like it was trying to get in. And I understood that something was very wrong with this place, that time itself had stopped in this room, that the people around me had been sitting in this moment for decades, maybe forever, and that I had just become one of them. The older waitress appeared at my elbow, and she was holding a fresh cup of coffee, the same cup I had ordered before, and she said in a voice that was soft and gentle and utterly inhuman, "Drink this, you must be cold." And I looked at her face and saw that her eyes were empty, were holes, were windows into a darkness that had no bottom and no end. I took the cup because my hands were shaking and my mind was screaming, and I did not know what else to do. And the coffee was hot and bitter and tasted like nothing I had ever drunk before. Tasted like the memory of coffee, like the idea of coffee, like a reminder of what coffee used to feel like before I forgot what anything felt like. And as I drank it, I felt something changing inside me, felt my thoughts slowing down, felt my heart stopping its frantic beating, felt my eyes wanting to turn toward the wall where the clock hung in its metal frame, and the hands never moved, and the time never changed. I set the cup down, and I walked toward the photographs on the wall, toward the frame on the right side where a man with broad shoulders and a strong jaw and dark hair looked out at me from behind the glass, and I saw that the date had changed, that it now read June 4th, 2026, today, this moment, this very moment, and beneath it in fresh black letters was a name that I had never seen before, a name that was written in my own handwriting, a name that was me. I understood then, standing there in the warm light of Earl's Truck Haven, while the fog pressed against the windows and the frozen truckers waited for me to join them, that I had always been here, that I had been driving this route for 50 years, and also for 5 minutes. That time was a circle, and I had finally come back to the place where I had always been, and the clock on the wall moved for the first time in decades, and the short hand ticked forward, and the long hand followed, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a truck engine starting up in the parking lot, heard it waiting for me, heard it ready to take me home to a place that had been waiting for me since 1974, since before I was born, since the beginning of time. The waitress smiled at me, and it was the first time I had seen anyone in this place smile. And it was the worst thing I had ever seen. A smile that stretched too wide and stayed too long and showed too many teeth. Teeth that were not teeth, but something else, something sharper and darker and wrong. She said, "Your rig is ready, Mr. Winslow." And her voice was the voice of my mother, the voice of my wife, the voice of everyone I had ever loved. And it was not human, had never been human, had only been wearing their voices like masks to lure me deeper into this trap that had been set 50 years ago and had been waiting for me every night since. I walked toward the door, and it opened this time, opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me to want to leave. And the cold air hit my face, and the fog wrapped around me like a blanket, and I walked across the gravel lot to where my truck was parked. And it was not my truck, had never been my truck. It was a rig from 1974 with rust and dents and a CB radio that crackled with static. And I climbed into the cab and sat in the seat and put my hands on the wheel and looked in the rearview mirror and saw that I was young again, was 22 again, was the man in the photograph with broad shoulders and dark hair and no idea what was waiting for him on Route 47. The clock on the wall behind me ticked forward again, and the frozen truckers began to move, and the waitress with the empty eyes wiped a table that would never be clean. And somewhere in the fog, a truck engine started up, and the story began again, and it had no end, had never had an end, would go on forever, because the road remembers everything, and the road never lets anyone leave.